Many of us have heard scientists tell us that we're made of stardust. And this whimsical suggestion is rather poorly formed for a number of reasons. And too often, like the products of science, is uninhabitable. Everyone knows that iron filings aren't living. And this comes from the dead stars, right? The elements, the periodic table, or much of it. And so they're kind of saying something like, over millennia and millennia, stars were born and died and made these dusts, these strange dusts, and in the electromagnetic waters of time-space, the dusts congealed. And somehow, we know not how, from this congealing, organisms arose, obviously as an expression of this congealing, as an expression of qualities inherent in those dusts. But a lot is missing from this story. And those dusts are dead, in a sense, that isn't like how we're made. Because we aren't made of dead, or rather, there's a second order of dust that is made of the dead dust. And that second order of dust is at least living. There may be a third order and a fourth order, which we do not even have ways of naming. But what's, I think, more interesting, rather than saying what things are or aren't, is just to recognize some very obvious facts. We are the living moment-to-moment result of the presence, character, and history of our star and our planet and local space-time. So that it is as if we are living organs of the sun. No sun, no minds, no math, no language. If the sun blinks out, all that disappears. Religion, everything gone. Possibly some, microscopic life forms on Earth might survive the sudden disappearance of the sun. But we can be quite certain that human minds would not. And we imagine that that link is more trivial than it actually is. It's really as if stars have organs called planets. And on some of those planets, the stars generate a derivative of starness called an organism. And it's an active derivation, the same way your hairs on your finger are, completely you. So we imagine ourselves separate from stars, or from our star, but there's no possible way that separation could ever be true. In fact, it's unclear that a human being could survive separated from the solar link, right? In deep space, for example, we have no idea if that's possible. We certainly think it is abstractly, but it may well not be true. It may be that our minds require the proximity of our star just to hold their form. We don't know. And I'm suggesting this is likely. So in a sense, there are many kinds of dust, and one of the kinds is particles, the charged particles that the sun bathes the Earth in. And all the forces of electromagnetism and that we've learned about from physics are all involved in this marriage that moment to moment is producing us and our minds and the possibility of minds. Our languages, our technologies, all these things are informed directly by the history and character of this exchange of living dusts. And some of them are like energy dust, and some of them are like matter dust, and some of them are like thought dust. And we get thought dust from culture. And so we begin to see a very strange kind of likeness here, where the likeness between a flower and the sun becomes non-trivial and not merely imaginary. Flowers produce living dust that we imagine travels on the wind, though it's a bit more interesting than that, as we'll get to other flowers. And the dusts mix, and there are many different kinds of these dusts. And the humans even exchange dusts between their flowers in a gel. And when this happens, new minds and lives are born. And there is a way in which minds and lives are like stars. And the ones that create the potent pollen, whether it is truthful or just beguiling, rise rapidly to popular attention. And we must imagine that the flowers and the likeness of the flowers and the stars is not accidental. Not a bit. And we must also notice that in the flower world, like in our world, there's relatively bipolar gender. The male flowers produce pollen that has to get across a huge gap, usually, especially at the size of the pollen, to a female flower. Now, sometimes that gap is probably commensurate at the size of the pollen particle to the distance between two stars. Sometimes it may be far, far greater. For it is not impossible that a single grain of pollen, microscopic to the eye, could travel to the other side of the world, and at the scale of that microscopic thing, it could actually travel around the world many times, perhaps even 1,000 times, and then land on a flower somewhere and pollinate that flower, fertilize it, and result in new life. Machines make a kind of anti-pollen, don't they? You can hear one in the background now. Dead, poisonous dust that kills living things, called exhaust. There's nothing in nature that produces anything quite like that. And some of our knowledge methods produce the likeness of that in our minds. That is, they give us sharp-edged pollen analogs, homologs, simulations, and over time we come to expect that pollen looks like this. And language and knowledge are one of these kinds of pollen. But I want to take this likeness a bit further and ask you to suppose with me that on a world where flowers clearly resemble stars. Oh, let's get back to the male and female thing. I branched there a bit. So the male star sends out pollen, and the female star is receptive. The female element is receptive. In our case, the obvious fact is that the sun is male in this sense, and that the earth is female in this sense. It is receptive and progenerative of the children of this marriage. And there are so many kinds of children that there are new kinds of children so fast you could never count them all. One of those kinds has minds like ours, maybe more of those kinds than we imagine or have discovered, because some of them may not lie in discrete bodies. In other words, some of them may lie in collective. Some of these minds may lie in collectives, not individuals, and we're not very good at recognizing that. But on Earth, there's an agent that crosses the gap between the male and the female and intelligently participates, we might even say tends, many of the vectors of the transmission of these pollens. And on Earth, this agent or agency is represented by many pollinating organisms. Organisms that either directly collect and transport pollens or influence their travel and destination dramatically. The most obvious of these to us are probably bees. And so I would ask you to imagine that we've not been very imaginative because it seems clear that as flowers are to stars, X is to bees. What are the bees at the order of the stars? What are the bees that exchange pollen between worlds? And this is a very interesting question to think about, and it doesn't lead to our common suppositions, although it may include them tangentially. The common suppositions would be whatever people think they mean by this idea of aliens. But I think it's far more interesting and strange than any of those ideas. And I have good reason to believe this, for I know the bees very intimately. And you might notice that we're killing the bees off because we've poisoned the pollens on purpose, the actual pollens. But long before that, we failed to discover that as flowers are to stars, minds are to seeing. And so our minds are like flowers, male and female, and each have both kinds, whether or not they have a superficial orientation. Yeah? And something's transporting the pollens between us, but it isn't us, and it isn't like bees. It's like machines. And it's destroying those pollens and reshaping them and telling them what to be, making them into artifacts and commodities. They no longer generate new minds when they land in other minds. They generate compliance, slavery, blindness, the illusion of intelligence as a standing habit of proud ignorance, catastrophe, war, violence, hatred, religion, technology, false collectives, ecological omnicide, a species that attacks everything that moves, every time it moves, including itself and its own possibilities of intelligence, while all the while parading about as though it were a god. The media, quote unquote, is the bees. But it's not the right kind of bee, and what forged it has nothing to do with the purposes that generate new lives, worlds, beings, and ecologies. Sustain and develop them, protect and nourish them. But quite the opposite. Something that reforges them into tokens, numbers, paper, slips, accounts that destroy the very basis of the promise of our human birth and intelligence and insight, and deliver instead an ever-increasing array of diseases that masquerade where once our humanity was alive and apparent. And so too our hope of discovery and intelligence, something better than mere equality, something better than the putative liberties we fail to receive even from the cultures that advertise themselves as thusly founded. The indigenous peoples understood something we, with our scientific and religious perspectives, with our technological and commercial perspectives, with our fake democratic and mostly fake communist perspectives, with our Republican perspectives, our Islamist perspectives, our Judaic perspectives, our Christian perspectives, fail to see that the world is a tiny, glowing jewel in which all of time and space are locally instanced, with all of their diverse intelligences and exquisite promise. And we are deprived of nothing but that which we insist upon rejecting and remaking in the image of an object. They understood the sky like the space between the flowers, and that there were magical dusts, living dusts, spirit dusts, that flowed between the stars, that something carried them. And they didn't think these things because they had stories or made them up. Unlike us, they knew the bees personally. They knew the minds of the bees, the home of the bees. They knew and were the allies of those forces and beings that are to stars and worlds as bees are here to flowers, and as media, unfortunately, has become to minds. But before there was media, there was something here on earth with us. And it's still here. There's no category in our language that could point at it. It is the chance of our participation with the real bees that live in the between of minds. And there is no hope or relation more astonishing to recover. No reward, nothing one can imagine. Because our minds were born to tryst with these bees as their allies and complement. Never having known them, we flock to poisoned analogues in image, concept, language, proclamation, description. Never having seen the origin of insight, we dwell in the exhaust, the sharp, dead shards of our own human promise, birthrights, and true intelligence. And now our cultures have been poisoning the pollens of the flowers and wiping out the pollinators. And one imagines that soon they'll attempt to replace them. not with living things or anything survivable, but maybe with tiny machines. But it is not meet that a machine carry the pollen, for the pollen will change to attract machines, you see. The flowers will change to attract machines and not bees. We must be very cautious and learn to see these things. We must get to know the bees here on earth. For it seems that we have forgotten how to know living things and how to participate in being with them. And yet, to any who will reawaken the spark, doors will open that would shatter all of human science, religion, literature, and expectation. For the bees of earth are indeed the derivation of their origin, and thus its local window, sensor, and expression. And believe me when I say the bees are aware of the humans. Your mind was born to touch and know the minds of other living species and places directly, in a way that none of our fictions or stories or magic or religions or science is capable of surviving. So none of them will bring it to you. You brought the keys to birth, and most of them were hidden when you were enculturated and in language. But when you feel awe or even fear at the sight of the impossible strangeness and beauty of any organism, that's the memory. And if you follow it to its root, that root will explode. And you will know firsthand the things I speak of. And trust me when I say, no experience you have had will prepare you for this. None will compare, and few will come near to the hope of exceeding it.